Prince William was literally steps away from opening one of the most sensitive royal summits of the year when he spotted a face in a room that was never supposed to be there. We are not talking about a surprise guest who forgot to RSVP. Camilla's private lawyer was already seated near the king's advisors, carrying a sealed leather folder, looking completely comfortable like he had been invited to brunch. William stopped in the doorway, scanned the room, and made a decision that left everyone around that table frozen. The meeting didn't get postponed for an hour while people sorted out a misunderstanding. It didn't get delayed while excuses were exchanged. He canceled it immediately, right there, and honestly, when you actually look at what was supposed to happen versus what William walked into, that reaction starts to make a lot more sense. The Windsor Summit had been called to settle questions that could literally shape the monarchy for years. This wasn't a casual catch-up over tea. It was a closed family consultation where senior royals were supposed to examine household authority, royal residences, private assets, and a division of duties during Charles's reign. The attendee list was tight for a reason. Only 2 constitutional advisors, the king's private secretary, and selected family members had been approved. Personal lawyers were explicitly forbidden because the whole point was that everyone needed to speak freely without outside pressure shaping their words. Yet Camilla's representative was sitting comfortably among them, with highly confidential briefing papers resting beside his hand. That morning, William had entered prepared for resistance. He knew disagreements were coming, especially over who would control Windsor apartments and private collections as his responsibilities increased. But he had expected those arguments to be honest. What he found instead was someone who had no business being there, already embedded in the room like his presence was totally normal. Camilla remained seated as the prince approached the table, and she urged him not to misinterpret what he was seeing. Her lawyer, she said, was present only to protect her position, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to want protection for. Everyone deserves to have their interests looked after. But William looked directly at the queen consort and asked why that protection required access nobody else had approved. That is the question that swallowed the room. Charles's advisors lowered their eyes while the private secretary searched the attendance list as if a name might suddenly explain everything. It did not. The lawyer had never been authorized. So the future king closed his briefing folder, placed it firmly on the table, and announced that the Windsor Summit was canceled immediately. Not postponed for an hour, not delayed while people figured out what happened, canceled. He said he would not discuss a single item until investigators established who admitted the representative and how confidential material had reached him. Camilla's face tightened, but William refused to retreat. He told everyone to leave their papers behind and ordered the chamber secured. Here is where it gets even more unsettling. Charles had not yet entered the room. The king wasn't even there yet, but someone had tried to shape the meeting before the monarch could take a seat. As chairs moved and footsteps faded, the prince noticed 4 words embossed across the lawyer's sealed folder. Windsor Household Continuity Private Instructions. The summit had been stopped, but that title suggested Camilla's lawyer had arrived carrying something far more dangerous than legal advice. He was carrying what looked like a pre-written plan. Behind that canceled meeting stood 3 people protecting 3 very different futures. William saw himself as a guardian of an inheritance he would one day be required to preserve. That is not ego. That is literally the job description of the Prince of Wales. Camilla feared becoming powerless if Charles could no longer shield her position, and the king, caught between his wife and his heir, faced a painful possibility that the 2 people closest to him no longer trusted one another. That is a brutal position to be in, and it explains why this moment wasn't just about one lawyer in one room. It was about everything that lawyer represented. William carries a responsibility that reaches far beyond one canceled conversation. As Prince of Wales, the title traditionally given to the heir expected to become the next monarch, he had begun taking a greater role in decisions involving royal residences, private collections, household authority, and the long-term division of duties. The future king believed every arrangement needed to pass through a clear family procedure. If hidden agreements were allowed to survive, they could bind his hands when the crown eventually became his responsibility. That is not paranoia. That is someone looking at the long game and realizing that what gets decided in private today becomes an obligation tomorrow. Camilla faced the same future, with fear instead of confidence. Her ceremonial position personal staff, security arrangements, and right to remain in selected royal residences could all become vulnerable if power shifted toward the heir. The queen consort, the monarch's wife who supports his reign without holding his constitutional authority, understood that Charles was her strongest protection. Without him actively defending her place, everything she had built could be renegotiated by someone who had no particular reason to prioritize her comfort. Now she sat alone in the empty chamber, gripping the arm of her chair as embarrassment hardened into dread. William's cancellation had exposed how little confidence he placed in her judgment, and William felt no satisfaction. Memories of Diana's final years returned with painful force. Private negotiations divided households, decisions made behind closed doors until mistrust poisoned almost every relationship. The prince had watched secrecy turn family tension into institutional chaos, and he silently vowed that it would not happen again. Yet his determination carried a cruel cost. Protecting the monarchy meant confronting his father's wife, and confronting her wrist-reopening wounds Charles had spent decades trying to bury. Charles received the news inside his private study. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the briefing papers, and asked his private secretary only one question: who authorized the lawyer? The secretary checked the official access list, the secured record naming everyone permitted to enter the summit, but found no approval from the sovereign, his heir, or the Windsor Secretariat. The visitor's name had appeared less than an hour before the meeting. That timeline is incredibly tight. Someone added a name to a highly restricted list at basically the last possible moment. Camilla's fear deepened when the documented entry review identified the source. The authorization had come through her private household, using language that described the lawyer as an essential advisor. William read the record twice, realizing the stranger's presence had been carefully arranged. That unauthorized entry was not the beginning of the crisis. It was a final consequence of a private struggle that had started weeks earlier. The path to the canceled summit began during a smaller gathering that almost everyone dismissed as routine. Weeks earlier, inside a quiet Windsor drawing room, Camilla's lawyer had placed a proposed household memorandum beside the Queen's teacup. One paragraph concerned her future residence, another concerned permanent access, but the final clause reached directly into authority that William believed belonged to the next reign. Tension had already been growing over who would supervise the Windsor apartments, ceremonial jewelry, personal staff, and invitations if Charles reduced his public duties for an extended period. A household memorandum was simply a written plan defining how royal staff, residences, and responsibilities would be managed. Yet, this proposal was anything but simple. William had demanded that every suggested change be circulated before the Windsor Summit, so the family could examine it together. The prince believed openness would prevent private interests from quietly becoming permanent royal policy. Camilla saw those safeguards very differently. She believed the future king was building a system that could leave her dependent on his approval for her home, staff, security, and ceremonial role. According to a documented account later provided by a trusted aide, the queen consort spoke with unusual bitterness after one planning discussion. She insisted that she would never allow her future to rest entirely upon William's goodwill. Her lawyer listened carefully, then began preparing language designed to protect her influence beyond Charles's active reign. That is where the strategy shifted from concern into something more calculated. The decisive breach came 3 weeks before the canceled summit. Camilla's representative attended a memorial planning meeting and presented a draft titled the Queen's Household Continuity Memorandum. The document proposed lasting control over selected Windsor rooms, certain staff appointments, and access to ceremonial possessions. Now, a memorial planning meeting normally organizes tributes, guest arrangements, and family responsibilities connected to a royal remembrance. It was never meant to settle future power. By introducing the proposal there, the lawyer had slipped a question of permanent authority into a gathering built around grief. That is a choice. That is not an accident. You do not accidentally bring a document about household control to a meeting about memorial arrangements. Catherine watched William read a copied version later that evening. He reached the final clause, stopped, and placed the pages down without speaking. The Princess of Wales asked what had disturbed him, and he answered that Camilla's proposal was attempting to transform temporary privileges into permanent control. Catherine heard the betrayal in his voice. He had asked for openness, Yet legal language had been prepared away from a family process. William still agreed to attend the summit, but only after receiving a written assurance that the lawyer would not participate. That promise was the reason his presence inside the chamber felt deliberate. The prince no longer saw an unexpected guest. He saw an ambush plan before Charles could enter. When you promise someone something and then do the exact opposite, you are not making a mistake. You are making a statement. When William returned to the corridor outside the canceled meeting, he was no longer seeking an explanation. He was preparing for a confrontation. The heavy chamber door had barely closed when William turned to Camilla and demanded a direct answer. No official stood between them, and no ceremonial politeness could conceal his anger. She insisted the lawyer was present only to protect her interests. William stepped closer, pointed toward the abandoned room, and replied that private interests had just been brought into a meeting concerning the future of the crown. He asked her to follow him into a small adjoining reception room. Senior aides waited outside, uncertain whether Charles would need to intervene. The crown meant more than the person wearing the crown. It represented the monarchy's authority, property, duties, and continuity. That is why private influence mattered so much. Camilla explained that the summit threatened everything shaping her future: her Windsor residence, household staff, personal protection, and ceremonial position. She wanted independent guidance before decisions became impossible to reverse. She tried to sound calm, but the prince cut through her explanation. He reminded her that a written assurance had specifically excluded personal lawyers from the meeting. She had allowed her representative to enter early, receive restricted papers, and take a place before several authorized attendees arrived. To William, this was not preparation. It was an attempt to make the lawyer's presence seem accepted before anyone could object. The future king accused her of turning trust into a trap. Camilla's composure finally broke. She told him that procedure was easy to defend when his future was guaranteed. William would inherit authority, residences, security, and a permanent place at the center of royal life. Her position could change through one decision after Charles was gone. The queen consort insisted that fear, not ambition, had driven her actions. And honestly, that part probably is true. Fear makes people do things they would not otherwise consider. Yet the prince heard something darker beneath those words. She believed protecting herself justified crossing a boundary they had agreed to respect. William leaned forward and asked a question she had avoided. Who gave him the confidential papers? Camilla looked toward the closed door, but offered no answer. Her silence changed the confrontation. If she could not explain how her lawyer obtained the summit agenda, then someone inside the palace had supplied it before the meeting. That meant the breach reached beyond one unauthorized visitor. Urgency spread through Windsor. Officials stopped the lawyer before he could leave and inspected the sealed folder. Under the palace's documented security procedure, they found an annotated agenda and several proposed amendments that had never been circulated to approved participants. One handwritten instruction stood apart from the rest. It claimed the central proposal had been already discussed with the sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch. William read that sentence twice. Camilla remained silent as his anger turned into something colder. The dispute could no longer remain between an heir and a queen. Those 6 handwritten words had placed King Charles at the center of the storm. Charles listened without interruption as William placed a disputed amendment on his desk. For several seconds, the king examined the handwriting, the legal phrasing, and claimed that he had already approved its purpose. Then he pushed the page away. His disappointment was quieter than anger, but it carried greater weight. No consent had been given, and someone had used his authority to strengthen a private demand. Charles still held decisive control over the royal household, meaning the staff, residences, schedules, and private arrangements managed in the monarch's name. William's position as heir did not allow him to overrule his father, but it gave the prince a duty to challenge decisions that could destabilize the next reign. The king understood both sides. His wife feared losing her security, while his son feared inheriting obligations created through secrecy. One needed reassurance. The other demanded truth. Charles summoned his private secretary and ordered a complete access review. The senior official was told to examine guest approvals, document circulation, and every communication between Camilla's household and her lawyer. An access review was a formal check of who entered a restricted meeting and how that person obtained permission. The secretary left immediately, but the monarch remained unsettled. Protecting his wife from humiliation now meant risking the appearance that he was excusing what had happened. William chose his words with painful care. He told his father that Camilla had every right to seek protection for her home, staff, and personal future. The betrayal came from using royal authority without verified consent. The future king said the cancelled summit could have produced decisions shaped by someone whose identity and purpose had been hidden from the room. Charles heard no desire for revenge in his son's voice, which made the warning harder to dismiss. Charles finally confirmed what William needed to know. According to their recorded private conversation, he had discussed Camilla's future security only in general terms. The king had never approved permanent household powers, invited her lawyer, or allowed his name to be presented as proof of agreement. That answer cleared one mystery while creating another. Someone had deliberately transformed a broad conversation into supposed royal consent. A palace aide returned with the electronic access request and handed it directly to Charles. The digital record described Camilla's lawyer as a special constitutional advisor, someone presented as offering guidance about the rules governing the monarchy. That label concealed his true role as her personal representative. William watched his father read the wording twice before setting the page down. Charles made his choice. He signed an immediate instruction suspending every disputed proposal and ordered a copy delivered to Camilla's private apartments. The king's signature settled the question of authority, but also forced her to face how dramatically her position had changed. Camilla read the king's instruction alone beside a cold fireplace. First came the suspension of the household memorandum, then the removal of her lawyer from all internal consultations. Finally, there was a sentence requiring her private office to surrender every confidential summit paper before nightfall. She finished reading, folded the instruction once, and remained motionless as footsteps approached outside her door. The consequences arrived quickly. Windsor officials revoked the lawyer's visitor clearance, froze his access to internal documents, and ordered all future legal submissions to pass through Charles's official secretary. Visitor clearance was a formal permission required to enter restricted royal areas or attend private meetings. Losing it meant Camilla's representative could no longer move through the palace as an accepted advisor. The cancelled summit was also postponed indefinitely while officials investigated whether confidential material had reached anyone else without authorization. Camilla asked to see Charles immediately, hoping she could explain her fear before the paperwork defined her motives. The king refused. Through an aide, he said he needed to understand precisely what had occurred before speaking with her privately. That decision wounded the queen consort more deeply than the restrictions. For years, she had depended on his willingness to hear her first. Now, the monarch was placing distance between them because her judgment had made even private reassurance appear dangerous. William felt no victory. Catherine found him standing silently near a window, carrying the weight of what his decision had done to his father. The Princess of Wales, the wife of the heir who supports his public responsibilities, reminded him that allowing the meeting to continue would have placed the institution at greater risk. Still, the prince could not ignore Charles's pain. He had protected royal procedure, but that success had opened a wound inside his own family. Camilla's senior aide entered carrying a locked dispatch case. A dispatch case was a secure container used for sensitive official papers. The staff member opened it and produced copied agendas, handwritten notes, and an earlier version of the continuity memorandum. She explained through a documented account that the material had been gathered from the private office after Charles's surrender order arrived. One note immediately changed the meaning of everything. The instruction was brutally clear. Camilla's lawyer had been arrived to arrive before William, so his presence would appear settled and become difficult to challenge once the heir entered. The queen consort read the line without speaking. Whether she had written it or merely allowed the plan to proceed, the strategy had been designed to trap the prince with appearances, and shared read the same instruction later that afternoon. The king closed the dispatch case and asked Camilla to meet him that evening with no advisors, lawyers, or household staff present. Every institutional shield had been removed. Husband and wife would now confront the betrayal in painfully personal terms, and shared read the same instruction later that afternoon. The king closed the dispatch case and asked Camilla to meet him that evening with no advisors, lawyers, or household staff present. Every institutional shield had been removed. Husband and wife would now confront the betrayal in painfully personal terms, There were no secretaries taking notes when Camilla entered the king's sitting room. Charles stood beside the fireplace, holding the instruction that had placed her lawyer inside the summit. She began with an explanation about fear and security, but he stopped her gently. The issue, he said, was not whether she deserved protection. It was why she had tried to obtain it through secrecy and his unverified authority. Charles asked her to sit, but he summoned no aides and allowed no legal representatives to enter. The crisis had begun inside palace machinery. Now it belonged to a husband and a wife. He assured Camilla that her residence, dignity, staff, and reasonable protection would be respected. Yet those personal safeguards could never become permanent crown authority through private agreements. Crown authority meant the official power exercised in the monarch's name, affecting the institution rather than one family member's comfort. Camilla struggled to control her voice. She admitted that William's growing influence had frightened her because his future was secure, while hers depended on promises that might disappear. The queen consort fear becoming irrelevant once the heir assumed greater control. She believed the summit could reduce her household, remove familiar staff, and limit her access to Windsor before she had any chance to defend herself. To her, the memorandum had felt like protection. To everyone else, it looked like concealed power. Charles acknowledged that fear without excusing the betrayal. He told her that using his name without explicit consent had damaged their marriage and weakened the trust required inside the monarchy. The king could forgive anxiety, but he could not ignore manipulation. Every private arrangement made under false authority created a burden for William and exposed the royal household to suspicion. Camilla listened as a man who had defended her for years explained why he could not defend this. Camilla finally accepted responsibility. In the signed statement that later documented the conversation, she confirmed that she had invited the lawyer and arranged for him to enter before William. She insisted she had never intended to force the prince into submission. She wanted the representative's presence to appear settled, hoping that removing the first objection would allow her proposals to be heard. That admission was honest, but it was also devastating. She had tried to control the room before the discussion began. Charles placed a continuity memorandum before her. The document was a proposed plan seeking lasting control over selected rooms, staff appointments, and household privileges. Camilla withdrew it completely and signed a declaration confirming that none of its provisions carried the monarch's approval. The hidden strategy was finished. Charles then telephoned William. The king did not defend his wife or soften what he had admitted. He invited his son back to Windsor for a smaller meeting built around complete disclosure. The secret proposal had been defeated, but the monarchy still needed to prove that trust could be rebuilt in the open. By morning, the empty chairs inside Windsor had become a national symbol. Broadcasters spoke of an heir refusing to enter a compromise meeting, while newspaper editors transformed the closed chamber door into an image of royal resistance. Yet outside the castle, public attention settled on something simpler. Whether William's decision represented family warfare or a necessary defense of the institution's future. Palace communications confirmed that the summit had been postponed because an unauthorized private representative entered a restricted consultation. A restricted consultation was a confidential meeting where only approved participants could discuss sensitive royal matters. The statement protected the family by withholding the legal dispute, the proposed amendments, and Camilla's admission. Still, its careful language confirmed something extraordinary. William had stopped an official gathering because private influence had entered a space meant to serve the crown collectively. Royal commentators quickly recognized the importance. The crown meant the monarchy's official authority, duties, property, and long-term continuity, not the personal wishes of one individual. During a recorded morning broadcast, one constitutional analyst described the cancellation as a forceful warning that private legal interests could not shape royal decisions in secret. The prince had not merely walked away from Camilla. He had challenged a method of influence that threatened public confidence in the institution itself. William hated watching the family crisis dominate every discussion. He told Catherine that the headlines had reduced a painful decision to a battle between an heir and a queen. The Princess of Wales reminded him that silence would have allowed the compromise summit to continue. If he had remained seated, the lawyer's presence might have gained legitimacy simply because nobody objected. That reassurance did not remove his sadness, but it helped the future king understand why retreat would have been worse. Camilla watched the same coverage from Windsor. She had tried to protect her residence, staff, and future position, yet the Queen Consort now understood that her strategy had weakened public trust in her judgment. The moment became unavoidable when a morning newspaper published a full-page image of Windsor's closed oak doors beneath the headline, "William refuses a room." Visitors gathered outside the Henry VIII Gate, the castle entrance used by staff and guests, holding copies as television cameras recorded their reactions. The story shifted again that afternoon. A broadcaster read the palace statement beside footage of William returning to Windsor for a private meeting with Charles. No personal lawyer accompanied him. No sealed proposal entered with him. The king had invited his son back under conditions of complete disclosure. William entered expecting another difficult confrontation. Instead, he discovered that Camilla had withdrawn every disputed demand and left a signed acknowledgement on the table. The public had witnessed the rupture. The final meeting would decide whether Windsor remembered as a family collapse or an act of necessary correction. The Windsor Summit eventually reconvened, but the room was no longer arranged as Camilla's lawyer had found it. There was no hidden folder beside her chair, no private representative waiting to influence the discussion, and no disputed claim carrying the king's name. Charles sat between his wife and his heir, opened a revised agenda, and declared that every decision would be heard, recorded, and agreed in the room. Charles began with rules nobody could misunderstand. Every future household proposal would be circulated in advance. Private lawyers could not enter family councils without unanimous approval, and royal authority could never be cited without written confirmation. A family council was a closed consultation where senior royals discussed shared duties and sensitive household matters. The new framework ensured that no personal arrangement could quietly become an institutional obligation. Camilla received protection, but not the permanent control her withdrawn memorandum had demanded. Her residence, personal security, staff, and dignity were formally guaranteed, yet her claim over selected Windsor rooms, future appointments, and continuing household authority was rejected. The Queen Consort would remain respected as Charles's wife, but she could not use that closeness to bind the next reign. For the first time since the crisis began, the boundary was unmistakable. William turned toward her and spoke without anger. Canceling the original summit, he explained, had never been intended to humiliate her. The prince had acted because allowing a compromise meeting to continue would have weakened his father's authority and the monarchy's credibility. Camilla accepted that fear had pushed her across a line. She apologized directly to Charles and his son, admitting that forgiveness could not instantly restore the trust she had damaged. Charles closed the signed agreement and delivered the final confirmation. According to the document recovery report, every unauthorized copy of the earlier proposals had been collected and destroyed under official supervision. The king's announcement ended the immediate threat, but William's next decision revealed what kind of future leader he intended to become. William did not demand Camilla's exclusion from later discussions. Instead, the future king insisted that she remain present under exactly the same rules as everyone else. That was discipline, not revenge. Charles preserved his wife's dignity without surrendering his authority, while she accepted limits that could no longer be privately rewritten. The cancellation became a turning point because it proved that closeness to the sovereign could never replace accountability. William had protected the crown without destroying the family. Camilla had lost hidden influence, but retained an honorable place. Charles had chosen truth without abandoning compassion. The first summit ended with a door closing in anger. The final one ended with that door opening and a monarchy choosing honesty over secrecy.